I'm a 54-year-old man who went through a divorce with my wife when I was 46 and she was 48. It happened 8 years ago. My daughter, who is now 28, stopped talking to me completely and sided with her mother without asking how I felt about everything. It took me a long time to come to terms with how things turned out and find peace in my life. My ex-wife tried hard to ruin my reputation, and that, along with losing my daughter, has been incredibly difficult. I deeply loved my daughter, and not being part of her life has been incredibly painful, especially because she was an adult when this happened, and I couldn't force my way into her life. She was firm in her decision to stick with her mom. I don't have much family apart from my mom, who has Alzheimer's, so this has been one of the toughest periods of my life. I tried reaching out to my daughter several times, but she was determined to stay on her mom's side and didn't want to hear my perspective. At one point, my ex-wife even threatened legal action if I kept trying to contact our daughter. Since then, I've spent the past 8 years taking care of my mom and focusing on work. I've had a few short-term relationships, but I struggled to fully trust anyone after what happened with my marriage. Recently, my daughter got in touch after all this time. I was thrilled, hoping she had come to understand that the divorce wasn't just my fault. This was especially comforting since my mother had just passed away, and I was dealing with that grief alone. My daughter reached out a few months after my mom's passing. I received a call from an unfamiliar number, and it turned out to be her. She mentioned she saw on Facebook that her grandma had passed and wanted to see how I was doing. I was surprised she had kept tabs on me online. We talked for a bit, and she suggested meeting in person to catch up. I was overjoyed and immediately agreed. We arranged to meet at my house over the weekend, and I was really looking forward to reconnecting with her. After all these years, I'm sharing my excitement with anyone reading this because my daughter recently came over for dinner. I wanted to cook for her and was nervous and excited when I opened the door. It had been almost a decade since I last saw her, and she was just a child back then, so I didn't recognize her at first. We started talking, and though it was a bit awkward initially, we both opened up as the evening went on. She told me about her life and work, and I shared what I'd been up to. After dinner, we finally addressed the lingering issue. I asked her why she never listened to my side of the story during the divorce, and simply sided with her mom by default. I admitted that her mom was more available as a parent since she stayed home, whereas I worked long hours in construction. Despite that, I'd always made an effort to spend time with her. My daughter expressed regret about how things turned out, saying she was too young to see things clearly and was influenced by her mom's portrayal of me. According to her, my ex-wife painted me as the bad guy who only cared about himself. Since my daughter never heard my perspective, she believed what her mom said without question. We discussed this further, and it seemed like we were making progress. However, as we talked for hours, she finally revealed why she had reached out after all this time. I asked her honestly what prompted her to reconnect, and she seemed uncomfortable. She confessed that she had been keeping tabs on me through Facebook. When she found out her grandmother had passed away, she expected lawyers to contact her about inheritance. But when that didn't happen, she decided to reach out directly. She then mentioned she had recently gotten engaged and needed financial help for wedding expenses. This revelation felt like a punch in the gut. Honestly, I thought my prayers had been answered after all these years, hoping to rebuild a family bond. However, it turned out my daughter's reconnecting was motivated by her desire to secure her inheritance. Ironically, legally, the inheritance is mine, and as she had been a better daughter to me, she would likely have inherited most, if not all of it. I've never been focused on money. I live in my own house, have simple hobbies, and buy my clothes from places like Target. Even if the inheritance were not in question, I wouldn't have minded helping with her wedding if she had approached me kindly instead of fixating on the money. All of this raced through my mind, but I kept my composure and asked her directly if that was her sole purpose in reaching out. She became defensive, claiming the inheritance was secondary and that her true goal was to reconnect with me. She said she regretted not reaching out while her grandmother was alive and had wanted to do so for years, but feared I wouldn't forgive her for abandoning me without explanation. She also admitted she was manipulated by her mom. However, her panicked demeanor made me doubt her sincerity, wondering if she was just trying to smooth things over to gain access to the money. I asked how she knew about the inheritance, and she explained that years before the divorce, my late mother had told her she would inherit everything left by my father, who had passed away long ago. At that time, my marriage was intact, so it made sense why my mother would say that to her. If not for the divorce and my daughter's abandonment, the money would indeed have been hers. The realization that she might only care about the money and had given me false hope crushed me. I was devastated but hid my feelings from her. To test her intentions, I decided to see how she would react if I told her there was no inheritance to claim. I asked her how much she was expecting from the inheritance, and her answer seemed carefully calculated. Then, I regretfully informed her that there was nothing for her to inherit. When I revealed to my daughter that her grandmother had left everything to me years ago, and that I planned to use that money to start a business, I couldn't assist her financially. Instead, I offered a few $1,000s from my own funds to help with her wedding expenses. The disappointment on her face confirmed my fears. She expressed appreciation but insisted that, as the only grandchild, she deserved a portion of the inheritance because it was her grandma's money. I explained that my decision was final and there was nothing more I could do for her financially. Her face turned red with anger, and she lashed out, calling me selfish and saying she was glad I was alone in life. Her words were hurtful, but I was not surprised by her true intentions. I stopped her from speaking further and confronted her, saying that she was just like her mother, only reaching out to ask for favors. I criticized her for trying to manipulate me while I was grieving for my mother, calling her behavior disgusting. She tried to say something, but I laughed in response, suggesting that if she hadn't blocked me all those years ago, she would have received my messages about her grandmother's situation and likely would have inherited the money. This revelation left her baffled, and she asked what I meant. I urged her to unblock my old number so I could resend those texts. After she complied, I forwarded the messages where I begged her to hear me out and informed her about her grandmother's Alzheimer's diagnosis, expressing the desire for them to meet before her grandmother forgot her only grandchild completely. This was all true, and it pained me deeply not to fulfill my mother's wish. Upon reading the messages, my daughter appeared ashamed and apologized to me. However, she argued that her grandma would have wanted her to have a share of the inheritance and that it wasn't fair for me to deny her that. Update 1. Hey everyone, thanks for all the responses and advice on my previous post. It got more attention than I expected, and it's given me some perspective. Many of you asked about what happened during my divorce, so I'll share a bit about that. My wife and I were married for 23 years. Despite all that time together, she betrayed me by cheating with multiple men. I won't go into the details, but when I found out, I was devastated. I struggled to confront her, turned to heavy drinking, and engaged in reckless behavior. This took a toll on my life. During this chaotic time, my wife and I fought a lot, which I think made it easier for her to manipulate our daughter into siding with her. After nearly a year of living apart and going through a tough separation process, we eventually confronted each other and got divorced. My ex-wife, who was a local journalist and somewhat of a public figure, used her influence to damage my reputation, which was incredibly challenging to deal with. It took me a long time to overcome my drinking problem and regain stability in my life. Unfortunately, my daughter completely distanced herself from me during this period, which was really hard for me to handle. I admit that I wasn't a good parent during those times. I wasn't there for my daughter when she needed me, even after the divorce. I isolated myself and struggled to cope. However, when I finally got sober and began rebuilding my life, my first step was reaching out to my daughter to apologize. Sadly, she refused to listen and blocked me everywhere. I had hoped that giving my daughter time would help mend our relationship, but it's been 8 years now, and things have only worsened over time. As for the questions about my mom's inheritance, technically, the money belonged to my father. My grandparents, both doctors, invested in properties around the city during their careers, which generated substantial rental income. When my father passed away when I was 21, everything transferred to my mom's ownership. During my marriage and for a few years after the divorce, the properties remained under her name. After my mom passed away, I inherited everything as her sole heir. In the divorce, my wife didn't receive any of it except for alimony until she remarried a few years ago. My daughter never stood to inherit any of this because it was all under my mom's ownership. Although my daughter knew that her grandmother owned properties, I never used that money because my earnings from my construction business were enough for a comfortable life. I don't expect my daughter to reach out again after that night. It seems clear that she was only interested in the inheritance, which is no longer an option. I'm disappointed, but I've learned not to expect too much from people, regardless of who they are. Thank you all for your support and questions. I appreciate it. I think it's time for me to move forward and consider dating again, focusing on finding companionship rather than waiting for ghosts from my past to return. Update 2. This past week has been quite eventful. I had thought my last update would be the final one, but life had different plans. I had just returned from work and was considering going out with friends when the doorbell rang unexpectedly. To my surprise and dismay, it was my ex-wife standing there. She looked different, with a changed hairstyle and having lost some weight, so it took me a moment to recognize her. It's hard to forget someone you spent decades with. Feeling unsure of what to do, I awkwardly invited her in since I didn't want her standing at the door. The atmosphere was tense and uncomfortable, as you can imagine. We made small talk, and then she mentioned that there were things she needed to discuss with me. She explained that our daughter had reached out to her after learning about the inheritance. I had suspected this might be her motive for visiting after all these years. My ex-wife then tried to rationalize her actions during our divorce, acknowledging that she may have gone too far. I couldn't help but scoff at that, but she continued without acknowledging my reaction. She urged me not to hold resentment towards our daughter for choosing her mother's side during the divorce, emphasizing that our daughter was young and influenced by the situation. I interrupted her, expressing that I no longer held any resentment towards anyone. I shared my disappointment that they only reached out to me now because of the inheritance. I reiterated what I had told our daughter, that if they had genuinely wanted to reconnect earlier, they would have been part of the inheritance. My ex-wife attempted to defend herself, but I firmly stated that my decision was final. If they were only going to discuss this one issue in circles, then it was a waste of everyone's time. After our conversation, I politely mentioned that I had plans and suggested she leave if there was nothing else to discuss. She nodded understandingly, apologized for the interruption, and departed. Once she was gone, I sat there in disbelief. I never imagined I would see her again, let alone have a conversation in my own home. It was a strange experience that brought back memories I would rather have left in the past. To clear my mind, I went out with my friends and tried to put the encounter behind me. I needed to share this experience to process it, so thanks for reading along if you're still here. Update 3. I have another update for you all. This afternoon, I received a call from my daughter while I was at work. Initially, I hesitated to answer, thinking it might be about the inheritance again. However, curiosity got the better of me, so I picked up the call and immediately told her that if this was about the inheritance, I didn't see the point in having a conversation. To my surprise, she said there was something else she wanted to discuss. She expressed that she had been reflecting on the past and felt that she owed me an apology. She acknowledged that she should have handled things differently and asked if I would be willing to forgive her and give our relationship another chance by attending her wedding. I was taken aback by her words. I asked her if she was certain about this, and she reassured me, suggesting that I take some time to consider it and let her know if I would attend. I agreed, and we ended the call. Now I'm feeling really confused. Part of me is thrilled at the idea of being at her wedding, but I can't shake the suspicion that this might be her way of getting back into my good graces to secure the inheritance eventually. On the other hand, if she is sincere, I don't want to miss the chance to mend our relationship. If I decline and she never reaches out again, I can't blame her. I would appreciate any advice or thoughts from anyone willing to help me navigate this situation. Last update. Update. I've made the decision to attend my daughter's wedding. Many of you offered the perspective that attending the wedding couldn't do any harm, and I agree with that reasoning. I don't feel obligated to do anything in return for being invited. It's simply as a guest, not part of the wedding party. I understand that going from being estranged for 8 years to walking her down the aisle would be a significant leap, and I'm fine with just attending as a guest. I genuinely hope that this is the start of a new chapter in our relationship, and I'm optimistic about the possibility of building something meaningful from this point forward.